Science department here and also affiliated with the Institute of African Studies. I, in fact, was the interim director of the Institute last year. And it's my real great pleasure to be the moderator for the panel tonight. The panel is called Kigali to Canada, a reflection on post-genocide Rwanda. And the way events are going to unfold here, we have sort of two halves. There will be an intermission in the middle. The first half, and I'll introduce them in a minute, we have an expert panel, three experts who will be reflecting on post-genocide Rwanda. In the second half, we will have a student panel, a group of students who are in Rwanda. And that actually requires just a little bit of explanation, because it's really, this event is very much a student-driven initiative, and it's one that began to take fruition while I was the director of the Institute of African Studies, and I was certainly glad to encourage it because it's a very amazing initiative. One of the great things that the Institute of African Studies does is offer a course called African Studies 3100, African Studies Abroad. It's an annual course where a Carleton faculty member teaches a course in Africa to Carleton students. It's a course that's been running about 5 years now. It's been to different African countries, South Africa, Burkina Faso, Ghana. As it so happens, I'll be leading the course this year, taking a group of students back again to Ghana. Last year, last May, the course went to Rwanda. It was led by Professor Thompson, Allan Thompson of the journalism department. And there were, how many students that went? 15?
15 went from here and 3 from Rwanda joined us.
15 Carleton students. And one of the amazing things that happened in the course, or one of the good things that Allan organized, was that it wasn't just Carleton students. So as I'll mention in a minute, Allan has had a long-standing connection with the National University of Rwanda, in particular the journalism school there. And so organized for 3 students from the National University of Rwanda to also participate in the Carleton course. And I'm told that there was some wonderful learning and some wonderful connections that happened as a result of the interaction between the Carleton students and the Rwandan students. One of the things the Carleton students had done was some fundraising, and with the intent of defraying the costs, because there obviously are costs of traveling over to Africa. While they were there, a kind of amazing thing happened. The Carleton students said, wouldn't it be nice if our Rwandan colleagues could come back to Canada and they could see, what we do here, and they could share with us some of our experiences at Carleton. And so they decided to dedicate the funds that they had raised, which had initially been intended to defray their own costs, to covering the costs of bringing some of the Rwandan students here. And so that's what's happened. It's taken a few months to get the visas and everything else in order, but all 3 of the Rwandan students have now joined us here in Canada. And so this event is really a celebration of the collaboration between the Carleton students and the students from Rwanda, and a celebration, I think, of the great connections and the great friendship that was established between the Carleton and the Rwandan students. So this whole thing has been organized by the students. It was their idea. I think it's a wonderful idea. And actually, I'd like to ask everybody else, if you're not one of those students, just to congratulate them on a wonderful idea. Now, these types of things don't happen with lots of people contributing, and it is my duty, my pleasant duty, to thank our sponsors, if you will. This event is part of the Research Month organized by the Faculty of Public Affairs, which is a sponsor. In addition, the Institute of African Studies and the Faculty of Social Arts and Social Sciences are also contributors to this event. So, I think that's all the preliminaries. As I said, there'll be 2 halves to our event today. First, the expert panel. And then after that, we'll take a short break. First we'll ask the expert panel to speak, after that, a short break, and then after that, the students. We've asked each of the experts to speak about 15 minutes each. They've each indicated that they might be a little bit less than that. Good thing, because I hope that will leave lots of time for questions and answers. So I'd just like to briefly introduce each of the members of the expert panel, and I'll introduce them in the order in which they'll speak. I've already mentioned Allan's name. Allan Thompson is a professor in the School of Journalism and Communication Studies at Carleton. He had a long career as a reporter for the Toronto Star before joining Carleton in 2003. While he was a reporter, he did go to Rwanda in the period after the genocide and reported on Rwanda and the genocide back to Canada, or the aftermath of the genocide. Out of that work, Allan has become deeply involved with the media in Rwanda. He organized a very important conference here at Carleton on the role of the media in the genocide in, what year was that? 2004, the major book that came out of that process. And Allan has also been the founder of the Rwanda Initiative, which is an initiative that links the School of Journalism here at Carleton with the National University of Rwanda, and is aiming to support the rebuilding of the journalism profession in Rwanda post-genocide. Our second speaker will be Professor Doris Buss from the Department of Law and Legal Studies. Doris's research focuses on the areas of international law and human rights, women's rights, global social movements, and feminist theory. She's worked a lot on issues of international responses to international criminal prosecutions, in particular areas around sexual violence in armed conflict. She certainly has been interested in the Rwandan case as one of the cases that she's looked at. I'll maybe allow Doris to introduce her work more deeply than that. And our third speaker, I've just met for the first time right now, Alice Musabende, who Allan tells me was the first Rwandan you ever met. Is that correct?
One of the first.
One of the first. So Alice is a Rwandan, born and raised there. One of the first women to graduate from Rwanda in journalism. She holds now a master's degree in journalism from Carleton University, lives now in Ottawa with her family, and has been a reporter on CBC and other networks. She's spoken extensively about the Rwandan genocide as well. So, brief introductions of our three panelists. The way, as I said, we're going to organize it, each of them will speak in turn, then I hope afterwards there'll be plenty of time for Q&A. Allan, over to you first.
Great, thank you. Well, I'll be fairly brief, and my interaction with Rwanda has always been as a journalist, I guess in the last decade as a journalism educator, but as a journalist I'm always reluctant to be referred to as an expert. Journalists are rarely expert on anything. Doris is nodding. But I did go there first in 1996, 2 years after the genocide. I wasn't there during the genocide, even though I probably should have been. I was working for the Toronto Star as a reporter, covering foreign affairs, but was as oblivious as everyone else to the events in Rwanda in 1994. I went in 96 when those who were watching live television at the time will remember the refugee crisis in what was then Eastern Zaire. Close to 1 million Rwandans who had fled at the end of the genocide were in Eastern Zaire, Congo, and the civil war was beginning in Zaire, and there was a major international crisis, and the world once again turned its attention to Rwanda and to that region. So I went as a reporter, spent a month there, covering the aftermath of the Rwanda genocide and the return of hundreds of thousands of people to Rwanda. And frankly became completely obsessed by the story, by the kind of the narrative of the genocide, and as a journalist, really struck by my own sort of ignorance in '94, and became very, very determined to start to look more closely at the role of the media, news media, during the genocide. And to that point, the sort of experts, academic experts who had looked at the subject, had looked most closely at the role of domestic media within Rwanda, hate media. And everyone's sort of vaguely familiar because they've seen the movie Hotel Rwanda, they've heard of the radio station RTLM, and there's a very clear narrative some people argue, you know, is it as clear as we think it is, but the role of the domestic hate media in Rwanda. And the media were essentially hijacked in Rwanda prior to the genocide. Those who were conspiring, planning to perpetrate the genocide, I think there's sufficient evidence they did very consciously use the media as a tool in that political effort to lay the groundwork for genocide and to implement the plan of genocide. So the media had played a very critical role, Rwandan media, in facilitating the genocide. I was also very struck by my own example of a journalist who could have covered the genocide and did not. So by the time I had transitioned from journalism to teaching at Carleton, started looking at the role not just of Rwandan hate media, but of international media, and how to sort of gauge the impact of the international media coverage, or the lack of it. And that resulted in this conference at the 10th anniversary of the genocide, and a book, a collection of essays on the subject, which looked a lot at hate media, domestic media in Rwanda, and the role of the international media. What grew from that, at that conference in 2004, we had representatives from the National University, a couple people who had taught Alice, came to the conference, and we basically agreed we should continue this collaboration. We should find a way for Carleton to somehow partner with what was then a young, burgeoning journalism school at National University, and try to help to build the capacity of the media in Rwanda. And to me, this is one way that international media could somehow, it's not restitution, but somehow address what had not happened in 1994. Well, then let's try to use some of the resources of international, well-trained journalists to go to Rwanda and try and help with capacity building. And so the title is Kigali to Canada, but initially my role was kind of Canada to Kigali. I established counterparts at the National University. It took till about late 2005, the beginning of 2006 for this to kick off. And I essentially fundraised in Canada and identified Canadian journalists. Some were professors, but most were senior journalists, people from CBC, the Toronto Star, who would be willing to go to Rwanda for a period of 8 weeks and teach. And essentially they were like supply teachers. They were filling the gap in a program that was totally under-resourced, didn't have enough equipment. And that became a 5-year project, which hopefully went beyond just supply teaching and filling the gaps. We did a lot of work on helping to build the curriculum, develop the curriculum, identifying some sources of resources, and then the interchange started coming back the other way. Alice, I met early on in that project because Alice helped me to make contact and to find people and to set up the project and administer the project at the start. And Alice eventually came here and studied journalism at Carleton. And 4 or 5 others have come from the media profession in Rwanda and studied journalism at Carleton. So it did turn into, over the course of 5 years, a project that I think took close to 200 people from Canada to Rwanda to teach. In parallel to the sort of injection of teaching skills, we started an internship program for Carleton journalism students to go to Rwanda and work in newsrooms as interns. So it worked as far as it went, but it's anyone who's been to Rwanda as a journalist, or certainly those who work there as journalists, know it's a very difficult environment for journalists to work in. It's a post-genocide society, and quite rightly, current government, and there's a lot of controversy around the role of the current government, does regard the media with some suspicion, and I think has made a decision to go very slowly, if this is even the goal, to go very slowly toward having a fully free, open, functioning media system. It's nowhere near there yet, and I actually think the government is not ready for it to be there yet. So there were some frustrations as an outsider trying to collaborate with the university there. Some of it was just our lack of competencies on both ends. I had never run a media development project before. I'm a journalist who became a professor. So certainly we made some mistakes. We didn't consult enough. We kind of told our Rwandan partners too much what we thought they should be doing. Looking back, I can see a lot that could be done differently. But we did come to learn. It was a very, very challenging environment in which, not just in which to be a journalist, but in which to try and build the capacity of the media. And while it never came, I should stress, in partnering with the university, there was never a single instance of anyone from the government or a position of authority interfering with the curriculum, with what we were actually doing in the classroom. We were at liberty to say what we wanted, teach what we wanted, but there was definitely some resentment at the notion of these people from Canada with our concept of press freedom and the role of the journalist criticizing the local environment and publicly talking about the state of press freedom in Rwanda. Now, it's not as if the project exploded or imploded or we weren't deported or it didn't end badly, but it did end. Essentially, the partnership sort of went on hiatus. At this end, the funding dried up, and the government of Canada was no longer investing in Rwanda. The US government had given us some considerable support. They stopped investing in media development in Rwanda. And I did honestly feel as if the university partner at the other end, their enthusiasm had sort of flagged for the partnership, and there was not much of an effort at the other end to try and salvage what had been happening. So I can't say with any certainty whether there was a conscious decision to end this collaboration on the part of the government. No one ever told me that, but things just sort of came to a stop. The good news is the collaboration for students continued for several more years. A lot of Carleton interns, until most recently last summer, went there to work in the media environment. It's a fascinating place for young journalists to go and work. It's a laboratory of what happens in a post-genocide society where the media and virtually everything else was destroyed and devastated, and you're rebuilding it from scratch. But it's not an ideal media climate, and I now have been away from it for a couple of years in terms of not being actively engaged. So it's hard for me to judge where is it heading. When we went there as a class in May, we spent a lot of time going to newsrooms, meeting with journalists, and we had this kind of hot and cold sense of what's going on here, what's really happening. But I think the best meeting that we did have was with a group of journalists who have started a new online publication called Kigali Today. 6 or 8 of them sat down with us, and they were incredibly frank and essentially explained, this is how it's working now. We will push the envelope to the point at which we realize that's where we've got to stop, but we are pushing a little bit. We realize where we can't go, and we go as far as we possibly can in the areas where we can go, and in an environment that is seen as being very hostile, a very difficult place to do journalism, there's a bit of a burgeoning development, particularly in digital media. And the number of people no one in Canada has figured out how to make money from digital media. They have figured this out in Kigali. These young entrepreneurs are making money from online media platforms, selling information. So that's an aspect that in all of the Human Rights Watch, the various organizations that critique Rwanda, rightfully, I do think there's a gap. I think they're missing a little bit of what's happening with this kind of entrepreneurial, digital media, online journalism. To me, that was the most interesting thing that we encountered, and it's an area where I think there's a lot of hope. And if I were going back now to start a media development project, I would go straight to these dudes that are running the online media platforms, and there are 4 or 5 of them that are quite financially successful, and work with them and see where it went from there. Okay. 11 minutes.
Good. Hey, I held them through the 15, didn't I? Doris?
Okay, so my comments are a little bit different. I started looking at Rwanda in the context of wanting to look at how international criminal courts were prosecuting sexual violence crimes, and this was in the early to mid-2000s. And so I was focusing on Yugoslavia and Rwanda, which at that point were the only two courts that were really functioning. And I wanted to see what the record was like after the first kind of flagship cases. And what as I was doing the research, I got much more interested over time. The record on prosecuting sexual violence crimes was abysmal. Right? They didn't do a very good job. The ICTR, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, didn't do a good job, and neither did its Yugoslav counterpart. And there's all kinds of research about why that is. But I also started to get really interested in the role of experts, expert witnesses, so which is why I'm a bit twitchy around the idea of being called an expert, because I was quite fascinated in how these different experts, academic experts on Rwanda, started talking about Rwanda and how the court made use of that expertise. And then I did a tiny bit of research around the use of gender quotas in Rwanda. And I'm currently part of a project with Blair Rutherford from the Institute of African Studies, some partners here in Canada, Partnership Africa Canada, and some partners in Rwanda, Uganda, and DRC, looking at women in artisanal mining, includes Rwanda. So little bits and pieces of research. But what has really struck me, what I wanted to talk about today, was the ubiquity with which Rwanda, in quotation marks, is talked about as a case study. And I've been really struck by this, and it's offered as a case study over a number of different areas. And it made me start to think about what is it about Rwanda and the caseness of Rwanda? How does talking about Rwanda as a case study, what kinds of analytical maneuvers does that enable? So my comments are a bit more academic, but maybe as a platform, some provocative discussion, particularly about the place of Rwanda in the Canadian imaginary. So in thinking about the kind of Rwanda as a case study, I'm drawing on the work of a theorist named Lauren Berlant. And she asks us to sort of think about the idea of the case and the different ways in which we talk about being on the case, making a case, using case studies. In all these different instantiations of case, you can find examples with respect to Rwanda. So first and foremost, we think about a case as an event, a significant event. And of course, Rwanda is that the 1994 genocide, the period April to mid-July, is the go-to example of a genocide, in part because, and it's a tragic thing to have to even talk in these terms, it is the most clear example of a genocide since World War II. It very clearly meets the legal definition of a genocide. There was a clear intent to try to destroy in whole or in part a group defined in this case as Tutsi. So it is often referred to as the case with respect to contemporary forms of genocide. The second way in which we can see Rwanda used as a case, this is very clearly linked to the Western imaginary, which is Rwanda as a case of the West's failure. So this is the failure of the West to intervene to prevent the genocide. And this is a story that's often told about Rwanda, particularly in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And in this case, we can see the example of a case study being used as a singularity in order to draw generalizable conclusions, right? So here it is the singularity of the Rwanda genocide being used to draw conclusions about the importance of intervention, about the international community's obligation to intervene, which takes the form of, particularly in the late 90s, early 2000s, of something known as the responsibility to protect doctrine. And that's sort of fallen out of favor a little bit, particularly with the US experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, but it's still very much present. And that invocation, Rwanda has very much a pedagogical function for the West, right? There's a lesson to be learned. And that leads to another context in which Rwanda is often invoked as a normative and a pedagogical story. And that's a more contemporary form, which is Rwanda as an example of post-conflict state building. And Rwanda is often held up and studied as one of the best examples of how a state should rebuild itself after a period of atrocity or a period of conflict. And it's not just any kind of state building. So Rwanda is often studied as the case of how to do state building through institution building. So Rwanda is studied and cited as an example of rebuilding from atrocity by redoing government in a profound way, by reestablishing rule of law, by rebuilding an array of government apparatus that would facilitate policy making around the delivery of public services, around oversight functions to minimize corruption. But I'm mindful of Allan's example that amongst those institutions that have been rebuilt, perhaps the media is less strong than some of those other examples. So in this case, Rwanda is often held up as a success story, in which Rwanda is then studied to see whether or not it offers salutary examples for other kinds of post-conflict or fragile state reconstruction. And an important piece of its kind of caseness in that milieu is its extraordinary success around gender and women's equality. So Rwanda is very much studied as an example of a country that's done gender very, very well post-conflict. So as some of you might know, in the period after the genocide and the transitional government quickly established a number of new laws to give women more equal rights in Rwanda. There was a change to the inheritance law, to matrimonial status laws to allow women to inherit property, to allow them to have bank accounts and run businesses. And then with the new constitution, Rwanda introduced a gender quota system as well as a quota for youth. And the quota system is seen as a huge success. In Rwanda at the national level, women hold 51 of the seats in parliament, which means that women occupy roughly 64% of the seats in parliament. And if you want a comparator, Canada, women occupy 25% of the seats in our federal parliament, putting us on the league tables. Rwanda's the top of the league tables globally. Canada occupies the 52nd position, somewhere just below Iraq and Kazakhstan. So, quite a remarkable success. Okay, so those success stories have been answered by studies of Rwanda as a case study, as a limit case, as indexing the limit of what can be achieved, because in these accounts, Rwanda is offered as a case of the dark side of post-conflict state building, and particularly the rise of an authoritarian state. And so here, the limit of Rwanda is also offered as a salutary example of the limits of what can be done in post-conflict state building. And the critics, I think, we can talk about in more detail, but people like Philip Renchins have also used Rwanda as a case study of the limits of what he calls genocide credit. Now, for my interests, I'm less interested in the strengths or weaknesses of Rwanda in these particular invocations as a case, but I think if we, what the breadth of the invocations of Rwanda as a case does for me is to raise questions about its caseness and what that says about what it is about Rwanda that we highlight as distinctive or exemplary, and the lessons that we then try to link to that exemplarity. And thinking about my talk today and about Rwanda and its case studiness, I had a few thoughts about what it is about Rwanda and why it is that we go to it as a case study. I think there's a few reasons. One of them, I think, is about, particularly this will be compelling, I think, in the Canadian context, is Rwanda in the guilt that it instills in us. Particularly Canadians, we look at Rwanda through the eyes of an imagined Romeo Dallaire. He is our figure through which we think about Rwanda. And Rwanda as a failure has a real powerful fundamental pull for Canadians. I think that Rwanda's success in doing gender has also meant that it has occupied a high position as a case study, because it emerged at a moment where gender equality was emerging very much as an international value, an international legal and political value, and Rwanda offered us an example of that was accessible. And I want to tease out a third idea that I'm still trying to think through, and I'm not sure if I have it right, but I also think that there's something about the relationship between purity and danger when we talk about Rwanda, and purity and danger are key notions in how we often make sense of culture and inclusion. And in the case of Rwanda, it's a pure example of a genocide, right? We accept that it is clearly a genocide. And there is something about its post-genocide trajectory that also speaks to us of a particular linear success. Even when it's questioned, there is a remarkable success story. And that purity, as an example, also lends itself to another narrative, which is the narrative of danger. And it might seem counterintuitive, but those two aspects, the purity of Rwanda as an example and the dangerousness of Rwanda as an example, seem to articulate together, perhaps suggesting something that is urgent within the Western imaginary for why we look to Rwanda. So those are my comments.
Alice.
It's really hard to follow a professor after this because now I'm trying to figure out my smart words. But it's good to be here for me because I haven't been in such gathering in a very long time. Can you hear me? Well,
No, that's me.
this is me. Yeah. Okay. This is me. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. So I was just saying that it's gonna be very hard to follow a professor because I don't know how to speak like a smart person, but I will try. I'm very glad to be here. But when they invited me, I said, "What would you like me to talk about?" Not that I have a problem talking, but because I wanted to get a sense of where to go, and they said, "Well, why don't you just talk about what you want?" So I don't know what I'm going to speak about, but I will be very brief. I think listening to the two of you talk, always, when people talk about Rwanda, it always brings me to, it's an interesting dichotomy. Everyone who talks about Rwanda either talks about its success or its failures. It's an interesting dichotomy of storytelling, which for me as a Rwandan Canadian now, it's always interesting to watch because that's not how I see it. I see rather a transformation. It's very slow, but it has changed. The reason why I say this is when the genocide happened, I was 14, I was 13 and a half, and I was turning 14. And dealing with the aftermath of the genocide was probably something that no one can really describe, and it was very, very hard for me and for people who were my age because we were teenagers and we were still trying to define ourselves and to figure out what we are and what we like. And I think that that's probably why I became a journalist. I was an extremely angry teenager. I wanted to say things, and I wanted to say that I was angry and I didn't understand why everybody had died, and I didn't understand what I was supposed to do. But everyone who knows Rwanda, above and beyond what people usually write about Rwanda, know that it's a society that is extremely, extremely hard to deal with because no one talks. And I'm not talking about just, saying things about the weather. I'm talking about challenges inside families to express pain or anger or other problems that people might have. And that's the type of family that I grew up in. Except that in 1994, at the end of the genocide, there was no more family. And the left parts of these families could not even deal with what had just happened. I saw my aunt who had just become a widow, and the entire family had just been decimated, and all she wanted to do was to go to church and go to work. There was no debates. There was no how you feel about this. There was no therapy. There was nothing. You just had to keep going. And I think that for many people who, these guys you're talking about from Kigali today, they're all my age. We are a generation of people who've struggled to tell stories. Even though we didn't know what kind of stories we needed to tell, there was something brewing. And I don't know why I went into journalism. I do. I wanted to piss off my aunt. That's a whole other story. I was smart. I went to a good high school. I could have gone to medicine, or I could have become a lawyer. But there was also a boy that I liked. So I went to journalism probably because I felt that there was things to talk about. And the journalism school at the time, this was the second year after the journalism school had started in 1999. When I went to Butare at the National University, it was a cool place with people. It was a new faculty, and people were talking about new things, something that was so new at the university that it felt like it was a place where you could go and debate about politics, even if you don't talk so much about your personal allegiances, but people would talk, and it felt exciting. And so that's probably why I started in it in the first place. There was this something new, something to talk about. But at the same time, I knew that I was a woman. I knew that it was going to be a bit hard to become the political reporter that I have now become in the Canadian Parliament. But at the same time, I wanted to push and see how far I could go. And so many of my classmates, we didn't really know what we were doing. When, a little bit before I met Allan in 2003 and 2004, we had a number of professors who would come to teach us, journalism stuff. Some of them would come to teach photography without a camera. Now, I don't know if you can imagine that, but it was really, really tricky. We didn't really know what we were doing. And there were a number of people who did really amazing things, but overall, we didn't have any direction of what the school was supposed to do and where we were supposed to go. But everybody wanted to create something new, and that's probably what has stayed with many of my classmates who stayed behind and did all kinds of things. And so the transformation that I've observed in Rwanda has gone from a society that was broken to pieces, but that was so angry and wanted to rebuild itself against all odds. And journalism is probably, in Rwanda, is probably the only thing that could probably explain or showcase this transformation. I mean, we had never had a school of journalism when I went to school of journalism. No one knew what this was supposed to do. And we were very aware, even at a young age, that the hate media had been there. And the discussions in the class were all about how to do things differently. So we did try to do things differently. And when I look back, I see a country that has changed. And I see a country not so much about the political change, but the people who've changed to become, to own their own stories. And so today, maybe I'm a little bit biased, but I see in younger generations, I see people who are less afraid than when I went to the journalism school and we didn't know what kind of stories to talk about. I see people who dream that they can do this. When I went in journalism school in Rwanda, we had to choose between communications and journalism as a, what do you call it? As a concentration. And I and my friend Hashel were the only two people who chose to go into the journalism stream. Everybody else went into communications because no one really knew what to be a journalist, except to be on television and read the news. No one was sure of what else you are supposed to do. And we didn't really get to be explained what we were supposed to do. So today I see people that I went to school with who have their own shows, who are reinventing, and they have, they do phone-ins, and they have created interestingly new options of doing journalism in an environment where even here it's quite hard to reinvent something new in journalism. So it's been interesting in a way. Coming to Canada and deciding to stay, and this is what I will finish on, was was another interesting decision. I didn't really know what I was going to do when I graduated from Carleton now 7 years ago. But I knew that I wanted to be the best journalist I could be, which I still haven't managed to do. But I think that my Rwandan experience, if I hadn't been a Rwandan woman, if I hadn't gone to the National University of Rwanda, if I hadn't gone through what I have gone through as a journalist woman who was trying to redefine herself, I probably wouldn't have been able to push in such a tough Canadian environment to be a journalist. And every single day I always wonder what I'm doing when everybody's being fired from their jobs here, but I still think that the encounters and the exchanges that I have had with different people through different experiences that I've had have probably given me and equipped me into pushing, and I think I'm going to stay in this job until somebody literally kicks me out of the door. So, yes.
So, thank you very much to our three experts, and although they may not like the title, I think they all three of them deserve that title. So what we'll do now is we have about half an hour for question and answers, and any questions or comments or observations you have, responding directly to any of the points that were made by any of the panelists, or any other questions or concerns or comments you might have related to Rwanda. Melissa is at the back. She's got a microphone, so if you could just, if you have a comment or question, put your hand up, and Melissa will bring you the mic so that other people can hear your comments. Who's going first? Emma was one of the students who went this summer, right?
Yes. So this is for Alice, I guess, and I guess maybe if you could just explain a little bit more some of the difficulties about being a journalist in Canada when you're not used to the kind of journalism environment we have.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think that one of the, and some of my professors are here, so the first thing wasn't so much about becoming a journalist, it was to study here. When I first arrived, I had never written a story that you don't actually literally copy from the internet. So it was a bit tricky, and I'm very glad Allan was there, and a few other people, to kind of say, no, you actually have to call people and write things that they've told you. It's a different way of thinking. It was really hard also to feel that I had the right to ask questions, which I think I still do even now, and it's crippling when you're a journalist and you still feel like you have to apologize for asking the question, where you say, I'm sorry, sir, would you please? Which is nice when it's outside, but in the jungle that the House of Commons is, you can't apologize for wanting to ask a question to an MP. So it's been a learning curve for me to learn those things that usually come to people very easily, because every single, now I do have a 2-year-old who thinks he's the king, so every single child who grows up in this culture has this confidence that comes with just being you. You think you can walk into a place and just ask questions. I didn't grow up like that. So it's a learning curve. The other thing that I did find fairly hard, but everyone talks about this, is there's this thing they call as, visible minorities people. It's a bit tricky because it's not easy to get a job when you're a visible minority, and even when you do get a job as a visible minority, people think you got a job because you're a visible minority, which is fine if you work in a government office that nobody really remembers what you are, but when you're trying to convince people that you're actually a damn good reporter who can write a damn good story, and people are like, yeah, no, she couldn't have been at the CBC just like that, they probably put her through that thing. It's very crippling in your own confidence and thinking that you can compete with everybody else because you're not at the same level. So it's some things that, yes, you can work on, but it's been, it's been a learning curve.
Melissa, working here.
So, as you guys said, there's a lot of great developments coming out in Rwanda, especially things like Kigali today, and a little less related to this, it's also kind of got a burgeoning high-tech sector. How long do you think it will be, or do you think Rwanda will ever be able to escape the perception where, as anyone in the West, anyone that really doesn't know any better, all that they hear is Rwanda, and the immediate reaction is genocide? Do you think as a country they'll ever be able to kind of escape that looming over them?
I mean, I always, when I was in the business of sending 20 to 15 young Carleton journalism students to Rwanda every summer, I every year encountered the horrified parents who just thought, you're sending my child where? So just the perception of Rwanda as this place where something so horrible and dangerous and treacherous happened is really hard to overcome. But it also doesn't help when your national narrative of reconstruction and building from the ashes, it's part of the national narrative to foster the notion that this is the place that has rebuilt itself. And I don't dispute so I've been there maybe 15, 16 times since 1996. It is really astounding, not to fall into the caseness trap, but it is really astounding to go there. It's like time-lapse photography. When you go there once a year, twice a year, for 15 years, 20 years in a row, it's mind-boggling. And even culturally now, the stuff that you don't see, the infrastructure, but when we went, I don't know if it was a kind of a sketchy strip club or a cabaret. The first night we were there, I asked a nameless fixer who was helping with things, we want to go out and have some fun. I was very determined that these students would see some fun and some life and vibrancy before we would go and visit memorials. So I said, let's go out and do something fun tonight. And we ended up in this, it was incredibly entertaining, but kind of bizarre. It was, I don't know if you know the place, it was above a bank.
What fixers you get?
But it was guys lip syncing, right? It was a music scene, lip syncing, but it was kind of semi-erotic. But it was funny, it was entertaining, and I'm sitting there thinking, all those parents who thought, where am I taking their 23-year-olds, would never have conceived of a, kind of an edgy, culturally interesting, thing that's happening. And so there's so much that's gone on that is not part of the, I had one student once who proposed a project, he wanted to call it the G word, and basically to do a project all about Rwanda that does not mention the genocide and the narrative of the genocide. Can you go there and explore the place and absolutely exclude discussion, deliberation, consideration, but because of the genocide, and is it possible? So I think it's difficult to overcome because it's almost a unique event in world history. Almost, it's not, but almost. And I think the government, which has been in power since the genocide, has fostered the narrative for its own reasons. And other societies that have experienced genocides do the same. And they actually learn from each other. It's a technique, I think, of nation building and generating support and playing on guilt to some degree with your donors and with your international partners. So that's a long answer to it.
I just want to say something. You use the word looming over them. I don't know why, but it rubbed me the wrong way. I don't know if the way we talked about Rwanda and genocide in, say, 2004 is the same way we're talking about it now. I think things are changing, even in the way we conceive of the narrative about Rwanda. I do see a lot of things on the internet. Of course, we always, as people, we always like to have something to hold on to be able to define the world, I guess, around us. But I have also seen an interesting amount of people who are trying, Rwandans, who are trying to redefine the history and the story of the Rwandan people and of the Rwandan nation. And it's very hard for people who didn't grow up there to see that, but 2 or 3 years ago, they started a debate club of some kind, teaching young people how to debate in public. This is something that would never have happened 10 years ago when I was at university. We didn't know how to debate anything. And so these debaters, and in the way they're approaching, I watched a couple of videos of these kids, and they're talking about things that people, even I, wouldn't talk about today. But these are 17, 18 years old high school kids who are talking about the national debts, and they're talking about issues that are so important that, and I think that it's redefining, and there is yes, the government probably would use the genocide for political purposes, but I think that there is a growing sense among Rwandan people to redefine themselves and reinvent who they are. And eventually, and I'm not even thinking it's going to take that long, I think very soon we will start to see all kinds of new stories emerging from that. Success stories, of course, but also just plain ordinary people reinventing what they are and who they are.
Doris, did you want to comment?
Just a quick observation. We have in Canada a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the residential school system, and I guess it's a really, I don't know that we would ever talk about that as something that looms over us. I mean, I think it's really important. The process by which you remember things collectively is so powerful and important to how you define yourself and make your connections as a collectivity. So I think it's something we need to embrace, not impose a false closure on.
Can I just add something quickly on the same point before we move?
Yep.
So during these visits, I was in Rwanda for the 10th anniversary of the genocide, which was a really amazing event, and for the 20th anniversary. So in both times I went to the national event in the stadium. And so the first time, it was packed, and it's a long, long day of a lot of testimonials and people speaking and talking about the genocide. And at one point, there's a commotion up in the stands, and I didn't understand what was happening. I thought there was a fight or a disturbance, and then another one over somewhere else. And there's 20,000 people in this stadium. And finally I discovered these are people who are being re-traumatized and they're carried away by ushers beneath the stadium. And I went down there, and there was like a triage unit, and people having horrible, reimagining genocide. So that was the 10th anniversary. And so I happened to be there for the 20th anniversary, in the same stadium, similar event, people giving testimony, a theatrical presentation that was very, very powerful. And once again, it starts to happen. People screaming and shouting and wailing and being carried out. But I realized, and I don't know the answer to this, and I don't know what it means, but a significant number of the people who I saw having these re-trauma episodes were people who were too young to have any living memory of the events. They were teenagers. And I'm not saying they're faking it, and I'm not saying it. So it's interesting, there's some kind of transmission of the family stories, so there were people who were literally re-traumatized by the commemoration, who did not have a living memory. They couldn't. They were under 20. They were too young. So I found that really fascinating.
Thank you. My name is Shakila. I'm the Chargé d'Affaires for the Rwandan High Commission here in Canada. And I would like really to appreciate the fact that you've been able to put together this event. And it's so encouraging to see that the initiative that Allan Thompson has started some few years ago and what the faculty is doing is really making some progress. Not only in terms of building the capacity of our young journalists in Rwanda, but also to inform the Canadians about Rwanda. Because I think the biggest challenge, as you were saying in a moment, is that most of the time when people talk about Rwanda, they talk about genocide. And though that will remain part of our history for forever, But it's very important that people try to understand the situation the country went through in 1994, and whatever is happening in Rwanda, the fragility of our country, the fragility of our people, that is something that people have to understand based on the history that we went through. 20 years might seem a long time for normal people, but for a country that went through the genocide, as you are rightly saying, every year when we start the commemoration period, it looks like it was yesterday for so many people. So whenever people try to judge what is happening in Rwanda, the freedom of speech, etc., it's because some of the people try to ignore or try not to understand what really happened in Rwanda. So I'm very glad that during debates like this, people get to know, get to understand what really happened. And I'm very happy that Allan Thompson, you mentioning that there is a possibility that you restart another project in Rwanda, and hopefully that will get the support it takes to get results that we are looking for. Just one last comment. I think, especially for you who organize this kind of trips to Canadian students going to Rwanda and come back here, get the Rwandan student come to Canada, I think the most important thing now is you know much better than other Canadians, the rest of the Canadians, about what happened in Rwanda. It's true that for most they refer to what Romeo Dallaire tried to tell them because he was there on the field and he knows exactly what was happening. But I think through this kind of initiatives, there is another opportunity of informing the Canadians of what has happened in Rwanda and what is happening today. We have done a lot, and you mentioned some of the few things that have happened in Rwanda, and we are glad that we have been able to do that despite all the challenges that come with a genocide. So thank you so much for your contribution, and we really appreciate what you're doing for Rwanda.
I think there was a question in the back there.
Like I was wondering whether there are still sensitivities within the Rwandese media in covering genocide or reference to stories that relate to it.
Alice, you probably follow it more closely than
You mean in terms of national coverage of the
Right.
genocide?
Right.
I don't know if I could say that there's sensitivities. We have, say, 3 platforms. Television always covers the official commemoration events. They do organize also debates on television where people meet and debate, talk about issues related to the genocide. Say, for example, if there's any new development, now it's closed, but if there's any new development with the International Criminal Courts, for example, this is something that is going to be debated on. We also have one official daily English newspaper that is printed, the New Times, which usually carries the official, the official lines of the government. You can find news online, and I don't know if I could say sensitivities, but I can say one thing, and I think it's quite a challenge, and I don't know how it's going to be. I think that the Rwandan media, and even the Rwandan people in general, haven't really figured out how to tell the genocide stories. We do say things that, we do say the testimonies. Everyone would probably know what happened to you, how your parents died, and that sort of things. But I think that as a country and as a people, we haven't, and I'm saying this as a journalist who's tried to write about the genocide, it's so painful to write about how one feels about the genocide. Maybe because it's too early. I've seen this in different other communities. The Jews who survived the Holocaust, it took most of them many, many years, many decades to actually be able to say how they felt. Not so much what happened, not in terms of, you know, the outline of the events, but more about how it felt. It's a bit tricky also in Rwanda because we, unlike many other communities, we do not get to separate people where, you know, like kids in the schoolyard where they fight and then you put one in the one room and the other one in the other room. So it's a bit tricky because we still have to live together. And I think that the media itself tries to follow the line that everybody seems to agree with, not so much because they want to be biased, but I think really honestly because we haven't been able to figure out how to tell this story yet. We do say what's happening, but it's quite interesting to watch. The reason why I'm saying this is because we haven't even been able to actually write books about what happened to people. We do have a number of people who've published fictional works or even personal testimonies, but we haven't come to that moment in history where we actually invent a new way of telling this horrible thing that happened to us. It's still taking a lot of time. So if we can't tell a story as a fictional story, I doubt we're going to be able to tell a story the real way that it is. So it's going to take some time again, maybe a few more years.
Thank you.
Hi. This question is in relation to something that you, Alan, brought up during your conversation, but hopefully all of you can address. So you mentioned that for Western media outside of Rwanda, that there was a failure to cover the story, and that was something that was missing. And I think about that in terms of the genocides in Bosnia and Yugoslavia were going on at roughly the same time. That's partially the reason why. And I think about current events that recently passed, such as the shooting with Charlie Hebdo and the massacre in Boko Haram, in which there was a prioritization of stories. And I wonder, I'm not in media, that's something I don't study, but I'm curious if the lesson of the importance of covering these stories and not letting other stories completely overshadow them is being lost, or what can be done to recuperate that lesson?
I mean, I think Rwanda's caseness, my new word, Rwanda's caseness is kind of, it was such a textbook case of a media, I think it was a media failure to grasp what was going on, to adequately report, to piece together the events in the fog of war, to actually realize early on this was planned, orchestrated, organized. In other words, it could be stopped. It's not mayhem. We could stop this. And so the media couldn't tell that story effectively, did not mobilize the international community to then do something about it. So it's that textbook case, and yet all it's done is provide us with an understanding of, yes, this is what happened, and now we just keep doing the same thing over and over again. But now we understand what we're doing wrong, because we don't care, and we don't, we, news media, there are fewer Canadian journalists covering Africa and the developing world now than there were in 1994. And the problem in 1994 was that there weren't enough, there wasn't a critical mass, no one understood Rwanda because no one had ever been there, couldn't find it on the map, so therefore just accepted the tribal warfare myth because it's kind of it was the frame that we found. So we understand it all much better now, and yet I'm not convinced that the lesson is applied. And it's partly just the political economy of the news business. The whole thing has just gone to crap. As a business model, we'll figure it out at some point, but the resources aren't there, and so, Boko Haram, we all know we're not grasping, understanding who are these guys, where do they come from, what fostered this, what allows it to happen, what's really going on with the government. Are they not capable, or is there, I honestly don't know. So all I know is the old Donald Rumsfeld, I know what I don't know, and what I don't know, and all that stuff. So it's frustrating because it should have been the absolute textbook case. We must not make this mistake again. Therefore, the Toronto Star should have bureaus in Northern Africa and Southern Africa, and no, now they have no reporters in Africa at all. no Canadian news organization has a bureau in Africa any longer. So, but we really understand what went wrong. We really do.
I just want to add something. I think that we have a fixation on the idea that just because something is covered, that is actually a good thing, and I'm sorry, Alan, but it doesn't always seem like it. I mean, we did talk so much about Darfur, but it didn't stop it from happening for the longest time. We did write about Syria. You know, everybody talked about Syria, and everyone had somebody posted in homes or whatever, you know, in the capital of Syria. What troubles me most is when everybody says, oh my God, another Rwanda is happening. It's absolutely horrible when somebody uses that sentence. Because every single tiny thing or every single big thing that happens, everybody says, oh, we have to do this, or another Rwanda is going to happen. So we've kind of become a reference for, you know, international talking about BS things. It's covering what is happening maybe is important. Otherwise, why would we want to be journalists? But I think we have to go beyond the idea of covering an event or beyond the idea of covering just something. And we haven't been, the media hasn't been able to really explain that. There's a difference between just having a front page with a big picture of, you know, children dying in Syria and actually having an editor or a media owner who really wants to push for something to happen. And the journalism world, at least the one I'm part of, doesn't seem to want to be that activisty. You know, everybody's just like, well, we kind of had that on page 3 last week. What else do they want? So then what? Then what's the point of having these pictures of people dying and tiny little babies in Turkey who are, you know, being blown to pieces if that's all? And no one has been able to really have this discussion yet. So to me, we can keep doing this, which obviously we're not making money out of anymore, or we can reinvent journalism. And I think that Vice Media has tried to do that sort of things. I don't know how much they're trying to do, but, you know, to really be part of the story and go in there and, you know, I don't know if it's the right way to do things, but I think that somehow we'll have to invent and reinvent the way we tell stories of what's happening, just because talking is not enough anymore.
Do you want to come in?
No.
More questions? All right, Joe, you get the last question.
Oh boy, hopefully it's a good one, no pressure. Doris, I'm sorry if I misinterpreted you, but you mentioned something about slow pace, and for me, the experience in Rwanda and the other talkers is that it's actually quite the opposite. Rwanda's experience has sort of challenged the idea of modernization theory. We've seen that they've been able to skip certain steps and move quite quickly in a nation that has suffered tremendously. And overall, I mean, in any state, 20 years is an incredibly short period of time. So I'm just wondering if you could clarify what you meant by a slower pace of what aspects.
I apologize. I didn't mean slower pace. I think that Rwanda is studied as an example of, you know, very linear, very methodical, very impressive velocity in post-conflict rebuilding. That is the dominant narrative. So not slow at all. No.
That was a terrible last question.
Anything warm and fuzzy we can end on? As we drive you to the silent auction.
All right, one last question.
The last one is cancelled.
I'm wondering, after talking about...
Is that turned on?
What? Is it? It's okay. I can talk loudly. I'm wondering, after the last question that we had on the role and failures of international media, if you think that maybe part of the solution for better coverage of these, well, really of Syria, of any sort of horror that's going on in the world, if maybe more sort of collaboration with local journalists, if that might be part of a solution, and how you might envision that partnership might work. You're shaking your head.
Oh, what's me? I'm a big believer in people telling their own stories, first and foremost. because they know much better than anyone else who might come from anywhere else. I mean, there are fantastic, foreign correspondents, but I don't think that they can really have the time or the resources to tell the stories that need to be told. But I'm also being optimistic because I think that the online way of telling stories is probably where the future of storytelling and coverage is going to be. We've seen when no one could go into Syria last year, we got all these pictures and videos of people dying, or Islamic State's guy talking to his people when there was no media, there was no international media, but somebody took a video of it. That's what we knew, that they were looking for and what they were trying to say. So the stories that need to be told are probably going to come in a different format. We probably won't have the same foreign correspondents telling these stories. They will be local. Collaboration, I think, I look at the Rwandan case, for example. Just from when I was at the university and what is happening now and the exchanges that happened over the last 6 years, they have changed not only the students who are at the University of Rwanda, but the way they see the world. So you not only get to tell stories, but you get to tell the stories in a way that other people outside of your immediate world would understand. And I think that's the part about collaboration that's quite interesting, is that this people that I met through, for example, Rwanda Initiative, they were veteran journalists. They would tell me, well, that's kind of not the right way to focus a story, or if you say it this way, you can sell it to the Americans, right? That sort of thing. So it's those exchanges that help maybe local reporters, and I've seen that mostly in countries that have been open, not just Rwanda. If you look at countries like Ghana, for example, where the exchanges have been there for a while, and you see British journalists going to Ghana or back and forth, you can see that there is a different way of telling stories that are actually going to be appealing both to the local people and to the international community, and they probably open up. And I think we're slowly moving away from the Africa as a single story of tiny babies and World Vision videos. But that's
Okay, we'll stop here for the first half. We'll take a 15-minute break, and when we come back, we'll have 6 students, 3 Canadian, 3 Rwandan students, so please don't go away. In the interim, there's a silent auction occurring just outside, and so over there, right, sorry. Silent auction over there, so you're certainly all encouraged to do that. So we'll see you all back here in 15 minutes.